Hi everyone, and welcome again to our Bobcast here at the Winston-Salem Symphony. We're so glad that you tuned in to find out about the next concert. We've had some great concerts already kicking off 2010. Hope you enjoyed the Matcast that you last saw, and our Discovery concert turned out to be a phenomenal success over at Winston-Salem State University. So we're here now to talk about our upcoming Classics concert, and I have my two scores for this upcoming concert with me. Here is my score for the George Gershwin Piano Concerto in F, and I'll show you this about the score. Clearly, I use the score a lot. One thing I thought I'd mention before I talk about the concerts itself is my score and the way in which I study. Several people have asked me over the course of the years about this, because I think even from distant seats, sometimes if you can see my music on the stand, you see that I use color quite a lot. I got this idea from my boss, Maestro Hermann Michael, when I was the associate and then resident conductor of the Phoenix Symphony. Maestro Michael, the music director, German conductor, who had been the assistant to Herbert von Karajan, the great legendary conductor of the 20th century. Maestro Michael used color, and so did Maestro von Karajan. So I began to put the idea into practice, and I found it to be very rewarding for me. The quick version of what I do is that if something is in yellow, that's the principal thematic material. If it's in green, that's secondary material. I use blue for tertiary material, usually pink for percussive type material, and then orange later on for something that's very interruptive. Now, I've told this before, but there is a very deeply researched musicological reason that I use these specific colors in that way. These are the colors that come in the 5-pack at Office Depot of highlighters when you buy them. So there's no real musical secret to it. But I will tell you that the research of using color and studying a score go back to Mozart. Even Mozart, when he was conducting in the pit his own operas from score, he would use color to highlight. So it's a good way to just learn a bit more about the music and hopefully get it a little bit more intrinsically into my system. So here are the two scores, the actual notes on paper, but let's talk about the concert itself. The concert is a look at Shostakovich and all that jazz. Now, at first sight, you may wonder how Shostakovich and jazz have anything in common. So we'll talk about the two composers and the two works individually, and then I'll bring it about to a thread of connection. Dmitri Shostokovich, Russian composer, and I think much more true to say Soviet composer. Shostakovich lived throughout the bulk of the 20th century, and as a very young man, the Russian Revolution happened. So he was about 10 years old when the revolution happened, and so the bulk of his life was under the rule of Lenin, Stalin, etc. Stalin's a specific part of this story, because Stalin, Joseph Stalin, and Shostakovich found themselves at odds more than once in Shostakovich's life. And I think it's fair to say that maybe the last person you would want on your bad side in the Soviet Union in the 1940s and 50s would have been Joseph Stalin. But that's where Shostakovich found himself. He wrote an opera called Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, and he really made great expression. It was a wonderful 20th century piece, and Stalin hated it. Stalin panned the piece. In fact, he wrote a review of it in Pravda, the Russian newspaper, and very publicly criticized Shostakovich for not being true to Mother Russia. Well, this is a very difficult situation for Shostakovich, so he began to write more in a way that was pleasing to the Politburo and pleasing to leaders. Shostakovich was a genius, though, and he had a way of writing his symphonies that perhaps on the surface there was this great homage to Mother Russia, but just beneath the surface, so much anger and cynicism and jokes and the shaking of the fist, and you hear that in his works. We're going to play the Shostakovich 10th Symphony on this concert. For me personally, I think one of the most amazing works of the entire 20th century. This is an absolute mammoth warhorse on the scale of a Mahler First Symphony or something like that. And this is the symphony that Shostakovich wrote when he first learned that Joseph Stalin had died. So this is the first time we hear Shostakovich writing without that thumb of oppression of Stalin. And there's an unbridled maniacism that takes place in this work, as well as unfathomable beauty and power. So I think you're in for a real treat with the Shostakovich. The second half of the concert features Gershwin's Piano Concerto in F. This is a phenomenal piece by a composer who I think needs no introduction. George Gershwin, absolutely one of the greatest composers, musicians of the 20th century, had a very short life. He was born in 1898 and died in the mid-1930s, so who knows what more would have come from his pen had he lived much longer. But it was in the early 1920s where the world really began to know of George Gershwin. In the 19-teens and sort of the era of ragtime, he was playing on Tin Pan Alley. He was a wonderful and well-known Tin Pan Alley ragtime musician, and they were beginning to experiment with this new form of bringing ragtime and blues and sort of the old African-American slave spirituals. All of this was coming together to form an entirely new type of music, jazz. Well, in 1923, the Paul Whiteman Band and Orchestra invited George Gershwin to do what they called an experiment in jazz, and that led to probably the most well-known piano piece of all time, George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. We played that on our Pop series this past year with Awad and Pratt. After that success, Gershwin then began to move much more into the world of orchestral and concert hall music, but incorporating jazz all the time. This piece is no exception. This comes just after An American in Paris and before Porgy and Bess, but one of his most important compositions, his full Piano Concerto. It's much longer than the Rhapsody in Blue, about twice as long. 3 wonderful movements, calls for a virtuoso pianist, and we have that with us, Bryan Wallick. Bryan played with us and the Winston-Salem Symphony, played with me in the Winston-Salem Symphony on my first season here. Back then he played the Rhapsody on a theme of Paganini. Now he's going to play the Gershwin Piano Concerto. Bryan's a phenomenal pianist. He's American, but actually he and his wife live in South Africa. So if you get a chance to talk to him, you'll notice he has a pretty interesting accent. Also, one interesting note about Bryan is that he has something called synesthesia. So if you meet him, ask him about that. Synesthesia is a condition in which a person always hears harmonic structure with very specific color in mind. One of the reasons I also told you in this Bobcast about how I use color to study. Every time Bryan plays certain chords, his mind is filled with certain color patterns. And this is a very interesting phenomenon, and I think it's a way that helps him bring out more color in the music. Something to talk to Bryan about at one of our question and answer sessions if you get the chance to speak with him, and I hope you do. So, Shostakovich, Gershwin, Russian, Soviet composition, jazz composition. What do they have in common? Well, I was interested to explore the manner in which two composers, writing under two very different sensibilities and two very different senses of freedom and constraint, could create music at the very same time in history. So Shostakovich is in the Soviet Union, he's feeling the pressure of Stalin and the Politburo, and yet he creates unbelievable music with such powerful pathos and wonderful cynicism and great, just below the surface energy that's almost anger but then becomes joy. And then there's George Gershwin, who writes with absolute freedom and the greatest of support from his country and from his government and from his culture to be as creative as he can possibly be, bringing this new art form, jazz, into the concert hall. So there you have it. That's why we call it Shostakovich and All That Jazz. Hope to see you at the concerts.
The Bobcast is made possible by an innovative project grant from the Arts Council of Winston-Salem and Forsyth County.